When you're 10 years old, your world isn't very big. It's your house, your school, the park down the street, and maybe a friend's house or two. My name is Jeremy, and at 10 I thought my world was just fine the way it was. That was before we moved to the small town of Crestwood. I didn't have a say in it, of course. My dad had gotten a new job, and that meant a new house, a new school, and worst of all, new friends. I wasn't the type of kid who made friends easily. I preferred keeping to myself, with my nose buried in a comic book or playing video games. But my parents didn't seem to care about my comfort when it came to a fresh start. The first few days in Crestwood were a blur of unpacking boxes and meeting neighbors, most of whom seemed friendly enough. Our new house sat on a quiet street, with tall, shadowy trees lining the sidewalks. It was the kind of neighborhood that looked perfectly normal during the day but felt a little too quiet at night. After a few days, I started school. Crestwood Elementary wasn't anything special, just another school filled with kids who had already formed their cliques. No one seemed interested in the new kid, and I was fine with that. I wasn't looking to make any friends until I met Dan. He sat next to me in class, and we quickly bonded over our shared love for video games. Dan was different from the other kids. He was quiet, like me, but he had a confidence that I admired. We started hanging out after school, mostly playing games in his room or riding our bikes around the neighborhood. Then, there was Alex. I first noticed Alex a few weeks after we moved in. He lived down the block in a house that looked off. It wasn't just old. It was run down in a way that made you think something was wrong with it. The lawn was overgrown, the paint was peeling, and the windows always seemed to be covered in a thin layer of grime. I had seen Alex walking around the neighborhood a few times, but we never spoke until one afternoon when I was out riding my bike. "Hey," a voice called from behind me. I turned to see Alex standing there, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his too large hoodie. He was tall for a kid our age, with dark, stringy hair that always seemed to hang in front of his face. His clothes looked old and dirty, like he hadn't changed them in a few days. "Hi," I mumbled, not really wanting to engage, but feeling like I had to be polite. "I'm Alex. You live over there, right?" He pointed down the street toward my house. I nodded. "Yeah, just moved in. Want to come over and play video games?" he asked, his eyes lighting up a little too much. I hesitated. There was something about Alex that made me uneasy, but I didn't know how to say no without seeming rude. Sure, I guess," I said, my voice uncertain. His house was even worse up close. The front door creaked loudly as Alex pushed it open, and the inside smelled musty, like something was rotting. The hallway was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, and there was dust everywhere. I followed Alex into the basement, where he said his gaming setup was. As we descended the stairs, the smell got worse, a sour, stale odor that made my stomach turn. The basement was dark and damp, with a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was a couch in one corner, and a small TV hooked up to an old console. We sat down, and Alex handed me a controller. I tried to focus on the game, but the whole atmosphere of the place made it hard to relax. "You okay?" Alex asked, noticing my discomfort. "Yeah, it's kinda dark down here," I replied, trying to sound casual. "We can turn on more lights, but I like it this way," Alex said with a strange grin. His teeth were yellowed, and I noticed that he never seemed to blink. We played for about an hour before I made up an excuse to leave. As I was heading out, Alex grabbed my arm. "You'll come back, right?" he asked, his grip tight. Sure," I said, quickly pulling away. I could feel his eyes on me as I hurried up the stairs and out the door. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house settling made me think of Alex and his strange grin. I told myself I was being silly, that he was just a lonely kid who wanted a friend. But deep down, I knew something about him was off. Over the next few days, I tried to avoid Alex. I spent most of my time with Dan, who had no idea who Alex was, despite living in the same neighborhood. Dan's house was the complete opposite of Alex's, bright, clean, and welcoming. It was a relief to be there, away from the unsettling vibes of Alex's home. But Alex didn't give up easily. He started showing up at my house unannounced, ringing the doorbell and asking if I wanted to hang out. At first, I made excuses, homework, chores, anything to avoid going back to his creepy basement. But he didn't seem to take the hint. Every day, he was there, waiting outside, staring at my house from across the street if I didn't answer the door. One evening, after my parents had gone to bed, I heard a tapping sound on my window. At first, I thought it was a tree branch or the wind, but the tapping was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I pulled back the curtain, and there he was, Alex, standing outside my window with that same eerie grin. "Can I come in?" he mouthed, his breath fogging up the glass. My heart raced, and I quickly shut the curtain. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every gust of wind made me think Alex was still out there, watching, waiting. I didn't know it yet, but that night was just the beginning. Alex wasn't going to stop. And as I would soon find out, he was capable of much more than just showing up uninvited. After that night, things only got worse. I told myself that maybe I had imagined it, that the tapping on the window had been the wind and Alex wasn't actually there. But deep down, I knew the truth. Every time I saw him afterward, I could feel his eyes on me, watching me too closely. I tried to explain it to Dan one day while we were biking around the neighborhood. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I kept it vague. "You know Alex, right? That kid down the street?" I started, glancing at him to gauge his reaction. Dan furrowed his brows. "Yeah, I've seen him around. Kinda weird though, right?" That was an understatement. "Well, he's been, I don't know, hanging around a lot lately. Showing up at my house and stuff. It's weird." Dan laughed, but it wasn't a mean laugh. More like he thought I was just being dramatic. "Maybe he just wants to hang out, Jeremy. Kids get lonely, especially in a place like this." "Yeah, maybe," I muttered, though I knew it wasn't just that. There was something much darker behind Alex's persistence. Something I didn't fully understand yet. Later that week, it happened again. It was around midnight, and I was in bed, desperately trying to fall asleep. My room was quiet except for the occasional sound of crickets outside, and the soft hum of the wind through the trees. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again, the tapping. Soft at first, barely noticeable, but then louder, more insistent. I pulled the covers up over my head, trying to block it out. Maybe if I ignored it, he'd go away. But the tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. Reluctantly, I peeked out from beneath the covers and looked toward the window. There he was again. Alex. His pale face illuminated by the moonlight, staring right at me through the window. This time, he wasn't just standing there. He was trying to open it. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I watched in horror as Alex slowly pushed the window up, inch by inch, as if he'd done it 100 times before. His hands were dirty, fingernails caked with something dark, and his face. There was something wrong with his face. His expression was blank, almost lifeless, but his eyes were wide and wild, like he was desperate. "Alex, stop!" I whispered loudly, terrified to wake my parents, but even more terrified of what he might do if he got inside. But he didn't stop. He climbed through the window like it was the most natural thing in the world. His lanky body slipped into the room, his feet landing silently on the floor. He stood there for a moment, just staring at me, like he was waiting for something. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice shaking. I could barely keep my breath steady. "You can't be here, Alex. You have to leave." He didn't say anything at first. He just kept staring at me, his dark eyes never blinking. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, he said, "I couldn't sleep. Can I stay here tonight?" Stay here? The idea of him staying in my room made my skin crawl. I shook my head, trying to keep calm. "No, Alex. You need to go home. It's late." For a moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, he took a step closer to my bed. Please? I don't want to go back there. Back where? I asked, confused. My house, he muttered, his eyes darting toward the floor. It's bad there. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt bad for him, but the other part, most of me, was terrified. There was something seriously wrong with Alex, and I didn't want him anywhere near me. I'm sorry, I said, trying to sound firm but not wanting to upset him. You really need to go. His face twisted into a frown, and for a second, I thought he was going to cry. But then his expression changed. His eyes narrowed, and his mouth curled into that same eerie grin he had the first time I saw him. Okay, he said, his voice low and cold. But I'll be back. With that, he turned and climbed back out the window, slipping into the shadows outside like he had never been there at all. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the lights on and sat in bed, staring at the window, half expecting him to return at any moment. My parents never heard a thing. In the morning, I told them about Alex sneaking into my room, hoping they'd understand how serious this was. But they didn't. Oh, Jeremy, my mom said with a sigh. He's probably just lonely. Maybe he's having trouble at home. You shouldn't be so hard on him. He broke into my room, I said, my voice rising with frustration. He came in through the window in the middle of the night. That's not normal. My dad put down his coffee and looked at me sternly. I'll talk to his parents. But you need to stop overreacting. He's just a kid like you. Maybe he doesn't have any friends, and he's acting out. I knew there was no point in arguing. My parents didn't see what I saw. They didn't see the way Alex looked at me, or the way he moved, like he was waiting for the right moment to do something worse. I just nodded and let them think they had handled it. That afternoon, my dad went over to Alex's house to talk to his parents. I watched from the window, feeling a sense of dread creeping over me. When he came back, his face was pale, and he looked shaken. What happened? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. My dad shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. They didn't seem right. His parents. Something's off in that house. I didn't press him for more details. I didn't want to know what he saw. But I knew deep down that Alex wasn't going to stop. And I was right. Over the next few nights, he kept coming back. Always tapping on the window, sometimes trying to open it, sometimes just standing there, watching me. My parents tried talking to his parents again, but they never got anywhere. It was like the whole family was wrapped in some kind of strange darkness. Then one night, Alex stopped tapping on the window. He broke it instead. The crash of the window breaking jolted me awake, my heart leaping into my throat. Glass shattered across my bedroom floor, sparkling in the dim moonlight. For a moment, I was frozen, too terrified to move. The sound was so loud, I knew my parents must have heard it, but everything was dead silent. No footsteps. No voices. Just the cold wind blowing in through the jagged hole in my window. And then I saw him. Alex was crouched by the broken window, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. His eyes were wild, wide open and staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He didn't look like the same kid anymore. There was something animalistic about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, like he was savoring the moment. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It was like my voice had been stolen, paralyzed by the fear that gripped me. My legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the bed, but I managed to scramble back until I hit the headboard, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Why did you make me do this, Jeremy? Alex whispered, his voice barely above a breath. His words slithered out of his mouth, cold and hollow. I didn't want to hurt you, but you wouldn't listen. Hurt me? I finally choked out, my voice trembling. Alex, you need to leave. Please, just go home. But Alex didn't move. He stood up slowly, his lanky body casting long shadows across my room. His clothes were torn and filthy, and there was a smell coming off him, something rancid, like rotting meat. He stepped closer, and I could see his hands shaking, not from fear, but from something else. Something worse. "I don't have a home anymore," he said, his voice quivering with a strange kind of excitement. "They don't care about me. No one does. Not my parents, not you, no one. So now, I'm staying here." The way he said it made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about hanging out or playing games anymore. Something had snapped inside him. He wasn't just a lonely kid anymore. He was dangerous. I jumped out of bed, my bare feet crunching on the broken glass. Pain shot through my foot, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. I had to find my parents, call for help, anything to get away from Alex. But as I reached for the door, Alex lunged at me. His fingers wrapped around my wrist with surprising strength, yanking me back toward him. His grip was icy, his nails digging into my skin, and his breath was hot against my face. "Don't leave me," he hissed, his voice a strange mixture of desperation and rage. "You can't leave me, Jeremy. I don't have anywhere else to go." I struggled against him, trying to pull free, but he was too strong. My heart was pounding in my ears, and panic was rising in my chest like a tidal wave. I didn't know what to do. Alex was losing control, and there was no reasoning with him anymore. "Mom! Dad!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. I didn't care if I woke the entire neighborhood. I needed help, and I needed it now. For a second, I thought no one was coming. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps pounding down the hallway, fast and heavy. My dad burst through the door, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. His eyes went wide when he saw the broken window and Alex standing there, his hands still gripping my wrist. "What the hell is going on here?" my dad yelled, rushing forward. Alex let go of me and backed up, his face twisted into a snarl. "You can't take him from me," he growled, his voice deepening in a way that sent chills down my spine. "Alex, you need to leave now," my dad said firmly, stepping between us. "I don't know what's going on with you, but this is over. Get out." For a moment, Alex just stood there, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his eyes darting between me and my dad. Then, without another word, he turned and bolted out of the broken window, disappearing into the night. My mom rushed in a few seconds later, her face pale with shock. "What happened?" she asked, looking between me and the broken glass. I couldn't answer. I was shaking too much, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Alex had completely lost it. He wasn't just strange anymore, he was dangerous. And I didn't know what he would do next. We called the police that night. They came, asked a bunch of questions, and promised to check on Alex and his family. But I could tell from the way they talked that they didn't really believe me. To them, it was just another case of a troubled kid acting out. But I knew better. Alex wasn't just acting out. Something was seriously wrong with him, something darker than anyone wanted to admit. The next morning, I stayed home from school. I didn't want to leave the house, not after what had happened. But as the day wore on, my parents got a call from the police. Alex and his family were gone. Just like that. Their house was empty, no sign of them, no note, no explanation. It was like they had vanished overnight, leaving behind nothing but the creepy, dilapidated house that now seemed even more sinister than before. For a while, I felt a strange sense of relief. Alex was gone. He couldn't hurt me anymore. I could go back to my life, forget about the broken window and the way he looked at me with those wild, desperate eyes. But that feeling didn't last long. A few weeks later, Dan and I were riding our bikes through the neighborhood again. We hadn't talked much about Alex since he disappeared. It was like we were both trying to pretend it never happened. But as we rode past his old house, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The front door was open. Not wide open, just a crack, like someone had been inside recently. But that couldn't be possible. The house had been abandoned for weeks. No one had gone near it since Alex and his family left. "Did you see that?" I asked, stopping my bike and pointing toward the door. Dan nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, that's weird, right?" We stood there for a moment, staring at the house. I didn't want to go near it, but something inside me, maybe curiosity, maybe something darker, pulled me toward the door. "Come on," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's check it out." Dan hesitated but followed me as I slowly walked up the path to the front door. My heart was racing, my palms sweaty as I pushed the door open a little wider. The inside of the house looked just as rundown and creepy as I remembered it, dark, dirty, and eerily quiet. But something was different. There, in the middle of the living room, was a pile of old, dirty clothes. And on top of that pile, a note. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I read the single sentence written in messy, jagged handwriting. "I'll be back for you." It was signed simply, "Alex." I dropped the note, my heart pounding in my chest. Dan grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. "We need to go, Jeremy." Now. We didn't look back as we ran out of the house, our bikes clattering behind us. But even as we raced away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Alex was still out there, watching, waiting. And I knew deep down that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When we first moved into that house, it didn't seem all that different from any of the others. It was in a quiet neighborhood in a small town in the middle of nowhere, USA. My family, Mom, Dad, my little brother Ethan, and I, had relocated because of my dad's job. He was always chasing some promotion, so we'd learned to settle in quickly, make do, and call any place home. This house, though, was something else entirely. It was late summer, the sun still hanging in the sky well into the evening when we arrived with a moving truck full of boxes. The house stood at the end of a street with only 2 other houses nearby, surrounded by a dense line of trees that gave the whole area a quiet, almost oppressive atmosphere. I was 16 then, and Ethan was 8. Being the typical annoying little brother, he was excited about the new adventure, running from room to room like it was some grand exploration. He was obsessed with Batman, and naturally, his prized possession, a sleek, black Batman car toy that lit up and made those whooshing and vrooming noises, was the first thing he unpacked. It wasn't an expensive toy, but to Ethan, it was everything. We settled into the house without much issue, but I started feeling something off, almost immediately. You know that uneasy feeling you get when you walk into a room, and it's too quiet, too still, like the air itself is watching you? That's what it was like, but I didn't mention it. I figured it was just the usual nerves that come with moving into a new place. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed completely unbothered. He was playing in the backyard on our second day there when he came back inside, holding something in his hand. "I found this," he said, his eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and pride. It was a faded photograph of a little boy. The boy looked about Ethan's age, maybe a bit younger, with messy hair and an old-fashioned outfit. Nothing like the clothes kids wear today. Ethan was excited, claiming the boy's name was Buddy. "How do you know his name?" I asked, glancing at the picture. "He told me," Ethan said, completely serious. I rolled my eyes, figuring it was just one of those make-believe friends younger kids tend to create. "Yeah, sure, okay. Well, just don't leave that picture lying around. Mom will probably freak out thinking it's cursed or something." Ethan laughed, and that was the end of it, at least for the moment. But that night, something strange happened. We were all getting ready for bed when I heard the unmistakable sound of Ethan's Batman toy revving up in his room. It was late, way past the time he'd normally be up playing, so I assumed he'd sneaked out of bed. I walked down the hall to his room, expecting to scold him for not sleeping. But when I peeked through the door, I saw Ethan sound asleep in bed, his Batman toy sitting quietly on his dresser. No movement. No sound. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it had been a weird echo or some electronic glitch. After all, toys can malfunction, right? I turned off the light and headed back to my room. The next few days passed without much incident, but Ethan started acting strange. He would talk to himself in his room, or in the backyard, whispering under his breath. When I asked him who he was talking to, he would just smile and say, "Buddy." At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids have imaginary friends, it's a phase, right? But it got weirder. Ethan started waking up in the middle of the night, standing at the foot of his bed, staring at the wall, or sometimes pacing around his room. One night, I caught him walking into a hallway at around 2 a.m., his eyes half closed like he was sleepwalking. I asked him what he was doing, and he mumbled something about Buddy needing him. It was creepy as hell, but I told myself it was just a sleepwalking thing and led him back to bed. But then, there was the toy. That damn Batman car. It started lighting up at the strangest times. Once during dinner, another time when Ethan was taking a bath. The toy wasn't even near him. The first time it happened, my parents just laughed it off, saying it was probably the batteries acting up. But it kept happening, especially at night. The car would rev up on its own, the wheels spinning like it was about to race off the dresser. One night, I woke up to the sound of it whizzing across the floor in Ethan's room. At this point, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went over to my parents and told them about the toy acting strange, but they brushed it off as me being paranoid. "It's just a toy, Sam," Dad said. "Things like that happen all the time. Old electronics, cheap wiring." But something didn't feel right. The way Ethan talked about Buddy, the way the toy seemed to move and make noise on its own. It felt wrong, like there was something else, something lurking in our home that none of us could see. Then Ethan's behavior got worse. He stopped eating with us, choosing instead to sit alone in his room, whispering to Buddy. He'd stare off into space during the day, like he was listening to someone I couldn't hear. And every night, without fail, that Batman car would light up, making its strange revving noises. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know if there was something more to this. Buddy. Maybe Ethan had met some weird kid in the neighborhood, or maybe there was a history to the house that we didn't know about. So, I started asking around. I talked to the neighbors, the few that we had, but they didn't know anything about a boy named Buddy. In fact, they didn't know much about the previous owners of our house at all. One elderly woman, Mrs. Gallagher, mentioned that the house had been empty for years before we moved in. "There was a family here a long time ago," she told me one afternoon, her voice shaky with age. "But they left in a hurry. No one knows why." That sent a chill down my spine. But Mrs. Gallagher couldn't, or wouldn't, tell me anything more. I returned home that day with more questions than answers, and that night, things escalated. Ethan had gone to bed early, which wasn't unusual by now, but around midnight, I heard the Batman car again. This time, the sound wasn't coming from his room. It was coming from the hallway outside my door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened to the toy revving up and the wheels turning, like it was rolling across the floor all on its own. Slowly, I got up and opened my door, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The Batman car was sitting in the middle of the hallway, its lights flashing, its wheels spinning in place. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. And then, as if the toy had a mind of its own, it slowly started rolling toward my door. I stared at the Batman car as it rolled towards me, the faint whirring of its motor breaking the silence of the house. My heart raced as it stopped just outside my door, lights flickering like something from a horror movie. Every instinct told me to slam the door, but I couldn't. I was frozen, just standing there, breathing too fast, my hands shaking. "Ethan?" I called out into the darkness, my voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. Gathering the courage I had left, I bent down and picked up the toy. It was heavier than I remembered, almost like it was resisting my touch. The plastic was cold under my fingers, colder than it should have been. I turned it over, looking for the battery compartment, and sure enough, the back was missing. There were no batteries inside. The car had been running without power. I dropped it like it burned me and stepped back, my pulse hammering in my throat. None of this made sense. Toys don't move by themselves, especially without batteries. I hurried to Ethan's room, my mind spinning, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. But when I opened his door, my breath caught in my throat. Ethan was sitting on the edge of his bed, his back to me, staring at the wall. His Batman car collection, the few other toys he hadn't unpacked yet, was scattered across the floor like he had thrown them in a fit of rage. His room was a mess, and yet he sat there, perfectly still. "Ethan?" I whispered, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer. He didn't even turn around. I could feel my skin prickling with cold, like the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. I circled around the bed until I was facing him. His eyes were wide open, but they weren't focused on me. Instead, he seemed to be looking past me, into the distance, or worse, at something I couldn't see. "Ethan!" I said, louder this time. I shook his shoulder, and finally he blinked, snapping back into reality. "Huh? Sam?" He looked confused, like he didn't even know how he got there. "What's wrong?" I crouched in front of him, trying to keep my voice calm. "Why are you sitting here? And why is your car in the hallway? How did it get there?" His expression shifted into something between fear and confusion. "I didn't put it there. Buddy did." That name again. Buddy. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Ethan, Buddy isn't real. You know that, right? He's just a pretend friend." "No, he's real," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He told me he doesn't like it when you say that. He's mad at you, Sam." A shiver ran down my spine. This was getting out of hand. I needed to do something before Ethan's imaginary friend became a full-blown obsession, or worse. "Okay, no more talking about Buddy tonight," I said, standing up. "Let's get you back to bed." He didn't argue. Instead, he crawled under his covers without another word, his eyes heavy with sleep. I tucked him in and left his room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder before closing his door, half expecting to see something, standing in the corner. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in bed, every creak of the house making me jump. My mind kept racing, going over everything that had happened since we moved in. The Batman car, the picture of Buddy, Ethan's sleepwalking, the weird noises at night. It was all connected. It had to be. But connected to what? The next morning, I told my parents about what happened. I even showed them the Batman car, still without batteries. But just like before, they didn't take it seriously. "Sam, it's probably just a coincidence," Dad said over breakfast. "Kids leave toys lying around all the time. Maybe Ethan was half asleep and didn't remember putting it in the hallway." "And the batteries?" I asked, my voice laced with frustration. "How do you explain that?" "Maybe the toy's malfunctioning," Mom suggested. "It's old, after all. We'll buy Ethan a new one." But I could tell she didn't believe her own words. She was just trying to calm me down. Things got worse from there. Over the next few days, Ethan became more distant. He stopped talking to me, stopped playing with his toys, even stopped eating much. He spent all his time in his room, whispering to Buddy. I tried to ask him about it, but he would just look at me with this blank expression and say, "Buddy doesn't like it when you ask about him." Then, there was the noise. Every night, without fail, the Batman car would rev up, its lights flashing, the sound bouncing off the walls of our house like a taunt. No matter where I hid it, on a high shelf, in a drawer, even in the attic, it always found its way back to Ethan's room. It was driving me crazy. My parents still refused to believe that anything was wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in that house. There was something else there, lurking in the shadows, manipulating Ethan, using his toy to communicate. I tried to get answers. I went back to Mrs. Gallagher, asking her more questions about the house. This time, she seemed hesitant to talk, like she knew something she hadn't shared before. "I heard stories," she finally admitted, glancing around like she was afraid someone would overhear. "About a boy who used to live here a long time ago. His name was Thomas, but his parents called him Buddy." My blood ran cold. "What happened to him?" Mrs. Gallagher's face turned pale. "He died. In a fire. It was an accident, or at least that's what they say. But there were rumors that Buddy was troubled, that he had a temper. After he died, strange things started happening. The family left the house, couldn't stand it anymore. I felt sick. All this time, Ethan's imaginary friend wasn't imaginary at all. He was real, at least he had been. When I got home that night, the house felt different, heavier, like the air itself had changed. I went straight to Ethan's room, but he wasn't there. His bed was empty, the sheets rumpled as if he'd left in a hurry. My heart pounded in my chest as I searched the house, calling his name. I found him in the backyard, standing by the trees, his Batman car in his hand, staring at the woods. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, rushing over to him. "It's freezing." Ethan didn't look at me. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Buddy told me to come." I grabbed his hand and started pulling him back towards the house, but he resisted, yanking his arm out of my grip. "He doesn't want me to go back inside," Ethan said, his eyes wide with fear. "He's mad, Sam. He's mad at all of us." And then, without warning, the Batman car lit up again, its headlights cutting through the dark like tiny, burning eyes. It revved in Ethan's hand, louder than before, and that's when I knew we had to leave. Whatever Buddy was, ghost, spirit, or something worse, he wasn't playing games anymore. I dragged Ethan inside, locking the door behind us, and for the first time in my life, I prayed that the morning would come quickly. But I knew in my gut that we were running out of time. Buddy was getting stronger, and he wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. The strange occurrences that had once seemed subtle, like flickering lights and eerie noises, became more intense, more aggressive. The Batman car was no longer just a toy, it was a symbol of something darker. It would light up without warning, racing across the floor like it had a mind of its own, even when Ethan was nowhere near it. I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every sound in the night, felt like a threat. My parents continued to downplay the situation, despite the fact that Ethan's behavior was becoming more erratic by the day. He stopped responding to us altogether, only speaking in quiet, cryptic whispers. Whenever I asked him a question, he'd pause, like he was listening to someone else before answering. "But he says it's not time yet," he'd say. "Time for what?" I'd ask, my frustration mounting. But Ethan would just smile, that eerie, detached smile that sent chills down my spine. On the third night after I'd spoken to Mrs. Gallagher, things took a darker turn. It started with the noise again, Ethan's Batman car revving up at around midnight. But this time, it didn't stop. It kept going, louder and louder, like the sound was coming from inside the walls. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding, and raced to Ethan's room. His door was ajar, the faint glow of the toy's headlights spilling out into the hallway. I pushed it open slowly, bracing myself for what I might find. Ethan wasn't in his bed. Instead, he was standing in the middle of the room, his Batman car gripped tightly in his hands, its wheels spinning furiously. But what caught my attention wasn't the toy, it was the walls. Scrawled across them in what looked like black crayon were dozens of words. Over and over again, in messy, childlike handwriting, the name, Buddy, was repeated, along with strange, cryptic messages. "He's coming, don't leave, you can't hide." I felt my stomach turn. Ethan had always been neat, never the kind of kid to draw on walls, and yet here he was, standing in the middle of this chaos like it was perfectly normal. "Ethan, what is this? What have you done?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. He just looked at me with those hollow eyes, his lips curling into that same unnerving smile. "Buddy told me to," he said, his voice soft, almost sing-song. "He's mad, Sam. He says it's your fault." "My fault?" I repeated, incredulous. "What are you talking about?" "Ethan, none of this is real. Buddy isn't real." At that, Ethan's smile vanished, and for a moment, his face twisted into an expression I didn't recognize. Anger. Fear. I couldn't tell. "You shouldn't have said that," he whispered, his grip tightening on the car. "He's really mad now." Suddenly, the Batman car started vibrating violently in his hands, the sound it made growing shrill, piercing, like an alarm. I reached out to grab it, to throw it away, But the second my fingers touched the plastic, a searing pain shot up my arm. I yanked my hand back, staring in horror as a burn mark appeared on my palm, like I had just grabbed something scalding hot. Ethan's eyes flicked to my hand, then back to me, his expression unreadable. "He doesn't like you, Sam. He says you're in the way." Before I could respond, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I whirled around, but there was no one there. The room suddenly felt stifling, the air thick with something I couldn't see but could definitely feel. It was as if the house itself was closing in on me. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in, my pulse racing as I rattled the knob, pounding on the wood. "Mom! Dad! Help!" No response. Behind me, I heard Ethan giggle, a soft, eerie sound that made my skin crawl. I turned back to face him, and that's when I saw it. The Batman car, still in his hands, had started to glow. But it wasn't the usual flickering headlights, it was something else. A pale, ghostly light, emanating from the toy, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. And then, as if in slow motion, the car lifted itself out of Ethan's hands and hovered in the air, spinning slowly, its headlights now trained directly on me. I backed away, my legs shaking, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. But no matter how hard I tried to deny it, the truth was staring me in the face. Buddy wasn't imaginary. Someone, was in that house with us. The toy floated closer, its lights pulsing in time with my heartbeat, and I felt a cold, heavy presence fill the room. The air around me felt thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature dropped dramatically. My breath came out in visible puffs, despite the fact that it was the middle of summer. Ethan just stood there, watching, his face blank, emotionless, like he was waiting for something to happen. I knew then that I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I had to get Ethan out, before whatever was controlling that toy took control of him, too. Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I lunged for Ethan, grabbing him by the arm and yanking him toward the door. He struggled at first, but I held on tight, dragging him with me as I fumbled with the doorknob. It wouldn't open. The lock had jammed, or maybe something else was holding it shut, but I refused to give up. I threw my shoulder against the door, again and again, until finally, with a loud crack, it flew open. We tumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, and I slammed the door behind us. For a brief moment, I thought we were safe. But then I heard it, the sound of the Batman car revving up again, this time louder than before. It wasn't just in Ethan's room anymore. It was following us. I grabbed Ethan's hand and bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. The house was dark, eerily silent, but I could feel that presence all around us, like it was closing in. We had to get out. "Mom! Dad!" I screamed as we reached the front door. "We need to leave! Now!" But there was no answer. The house was empty, abandoned, like they had never been there at all. My stomach twisted with dread, but I didn't have time to think. I yanked the front door open, pulling Ethan outside into the cold night air. For a moment, we stood there in the yard, breathing hard, the house looming behind us like some dark, hulking beast. The air was still, too quiet, and I half expected that toy to come barreling out of the door after us. But nothing happened. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I turned to Ethan, gripping his shoulders. "Are you okay?" He nodded, but his eyes were wide with fear. "He's still inside," he whispered. "But he's still in there." I looked back at the house, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to believe anymore, whether Buddy was a ghost, a demon, or just some manifestation of the house's dark past. But one thing was clear, we couldn't go back in. Not now, not ever. We didn't. My parents came back later that night, bewildered when they found us sitting on the front porch. I tried to explain what had happened, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. They didn't believe me, not really. But we moved out the next day, without hesitation. My parents chalked it up to a faulty electrical system and overactive imaginations. But I knew better. I knew that Buddy was real, that he was still in that house, waiting for someone else to find him. I haven't seen that Batman car since, but sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of wheels rolling across the floor, revving up for another round. I'll never know what Buddy really was, or why he chose Ethan. But one thing's for sure. We got out just in time.